Hello, this is Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy, speaking to you today, not from my office in Washington, but from a remote public library in West Virginia, with the pleasure and privilege of talking to Dr. Tim Keller, a longtime pastor of one of America's most famous and accomplished churches in New York City, a prolific author and public thinker who has a new book out called Forgiveness, if I'm recalling the title correctly.
Forgive.
Forgive.
Just forgive.
Why we should and how we should, if I'm approximating the title. Hopefully you have a copy within reach that you can hold up, Dr. Keller.
I actually don't have a copy yet. It's coming in November 1. And we're doing this recording a little before I actually have the copy. But it's, if you go to Amazon, you'll see the cover copy. It's a pre-order.
And you have written, I believe, at least a dozen other books. Why did you choose this topic at this stage of your career, having retired several years ago?
Well, whenever I'm going to write a book, I don't want to just say, oh, what do I have around that could get my name on the cover of something? I really want to make a contribution. I want to do something I feel like hasn't been done. But I'm a pastor. I'm not a pundit. I'm not a scholar even, really. I'm not an academic. And so as a pastor, I know that the issue of forgiveness is incredibly practical. That I can now do marriage counseling without talking about forgiveness. I can't do, when relationships go bad in a church or anywhere, you're always talking about forgiveness. You can't talk to people who've got shame and guilt without talking about forgiveness. But on the other hand, I did perceive, Mark, in the last 4 or 5 years, that forgiveness, in light of some of the major social movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter and things like that, that the traditional understanding of forgiveness was actually somewhat under attack. That a lot of people felt like, especially the younger people, feel like, well, we should be after justice, we shouldn't forgive. That's letting people off the hook. Let's go for justice. And so I realized that even though it was a practical thing that I, as a pastor and preacher, had been talking about for 40 years, I also realized, to my surprise, that it was actually a kind of cultural. It was a very important thing to talk about in our cultural moment. And there's a fair number. It's not. I wouldn't say it's like headline. But I'm surprised, even New York Times just last week, whenever people talk about cancel culture and is it right or wrong, they're really talking about forgiveness. And an awful lot of times when there's a major violent shooting or something like that, and let's just say that the sibling or the brother, sister of the dead person forgives the shooter and says, I forgive you. And then people are just completely divided about it. Some people say that's absolutely wrong. Other people say, isn't that the greatest thing you've ever seen? So I realized it was a practical thing. And I do want, to give people something that actually they can use in their actual everyday lives. And yet it was also speaking to a cultural issue. So that's why I chose it.
Now, not having yet read your book, which doesn't come out to November 1st, I don't have an advance copy. I assume your book is mostly about personal forgiveness, or is that assuming too much?
Well, it's both about, yes, it's mainly about personal forgiveness, and yet it does talk about groups reconciling. Miroslav Volf many years ago wrote a fairly academic book called Exclusion and Embrace, and Miroslav is Croatian, and he wrote that. Though he's lived in America for years, he wrote that out of looking at how when Yugoslavia broke up and all the terrible things that were happening there between Serbia and Croatia and all that. He asked the question: Is there a way to reach out and do reconciliation between groups that have wronged one another without, in a sense, without at the same time just overlooking all the injustices? And he actually in the book talks about the fact that you can seek justice and also reconciliation at the same time. So I mentioned that, but you're right in your intuition that I'm talking more about personal, because I think the average reader in America that's what they're looking for and what they need.
Now, I don't know how autobiographical your book is, but have there been instances in your life where you have been on the receiving end of a gross injustice that you've had to forgive, which informs your understanding theologically of forgiveness? And have there been instances where you have committed grievous wrongs and have had to ask for forgiveness that also informs your perspective in this book?
Uh, no, there hasn't. Well, yeah, actually, some other folks have asked me that and said is there some, I don't know, benchmark uh, moment in your life where someone wronged you or you wronged somebody and you sought forgiveness or you gave it? I would say actually no. I have not. I have not experienced something like that by far. And I talked about this in my book on marriage, with the book I wrote with Kathy, my wife, is by far the greatest arena in which I've had to work out forgiveness is in my marriage. And it's really in the little ways that you hurt and ignore one another. And it's I know when you think about forgiveness, you think about the dramatic cases of how, and I have some in the book. I have a lot in the book. Like the parents of a girl that was raped and killed, is they supposed to forgive the man who did it? And that's the dramatic. But and that is very important. And there's a story I have in the book about a couple whose daughter was raped and killed. And when they forgave the killer, many other parents who'd experienced the same thing were furious at them. And other parents were very grateful for it. And so if the story is fascinating, but I have not been through that. And I would go so far as to say, I think there is a danger at the other end. Both my wife and I have come to recognize, and I think we have an ordinarily good marriage, maybe even above average marriage. But it is extraordinarily easy to let little wrongs build up. You think you've forgiven the other person and you haven't. And then what happens is you can find periods in your life where, in your marriage, where suddenly the taste has gone out of the marriage, or the zip or something. And what's really happened is you've drifted apart, partly because you actually haven't gone through what I would say, the renewal of the marriage through repentance, forgiveness. Because when you really repent and really forgive, it always renews the marriage. It's actually, I mean, I'm not overdoing it. I'm a Presbyterian, so I'm big on the sacraments and all that. It's a little bit like the Lord's Supper, where you're renewing your relationship with Jesus. You're repenting and receiving forgiveness afresh. There's a sense in which you've got to be doing that in your marriage, or else it goes stale. And you tell yourself, "Oh, I'm not mad at her," or "I'm not mad at him." No, I've forgiven. And then you realize at a certain point, no, you really haven't. See, that to me, that's where I've had to learn about it. And it's almost as dangerous to miss out on forgiveness in the little things, because you have a self-image of yourself as a very big person who doesn't get upset about these things. No, I'm fine. No problem. Think nothing of it. Forget about it. We would say in Brooklyn, forget about it. So and yet there's a danger there, that your pride, in a sense, keeps you from saying, you know what, you actually do have to go through the work of forgiveness. So that's where I have had to learn, but there's nothing dramatic. So I have nothing to tell you. I've just talked to my wife and she'll tell you.
Well, too bad. Now, your extraordinary pastorate spanned 40 years, starting out in a smaller town in Virginia. Obviously, most of your pastorate was in America's largest city.
Yeah.
This is from the 1980s until just a few years ago. Are there differences in terms of how different cultures address forgiveness, rural, small town versus big city? And are there differences between how people were dealing with forgiveness, Christian people, in the 1980s versus now?
Well, now the first part of that question, nobody's asked me that, and that's really interesting. I would say that in my blue collar town and in the past, I could put more. Frankly, when I called people to forgive, they would say, "You're right, I need to. I don't know how." They have been raised with the idea that forgiveness was the right thing to do, but they struggled Whereas I did find when I got to New York, when I would talk to people about forgiveness, sometimes the people would say, and these were New Yorkers though, but they were in my own church, so it's not like I was, I was their pastor. You got the impression, or sometimes they came out and said, mind your own business.
Hmm.
They, first of all, they were more individualistic and did not feel they felt like my life is my own and what I have to do is my own. I mean, as Christians, they gave lip service to the idea that they're part of a community and would need help. But when it came right down, if I was said, I think you need to forgive, they would really bristle. Whereas in a more blue collar town, and in the past, there was more sense of, I'm part of a community, you need to help me forgive, please do. The other thing, of course, is that there's the reason I wrote the book. The last 10 years, I've gotten more and more, especially from younger people, a real feeling like I can't forgive because I need to pursue justice. And one of the messages of the book, Mark, is I believe unless you forgive, you won't pursue justice, you'll pursue vengeance. That you can do you can do it at the same time. To forgive means I'm no longer trying to pay you back for hurting me. Forgiveness means I'm not going to pay you back. I'm not going to take vengeance. But why now do I pursue justice? And the reason I pursue justice after I've forgiven is for the sake of the perpetrator. God, you'd like to change that person. That person's not going to have a happy life if they keep doing that. Secondly, for God's sake, to honor him. Thirdly, for other victims' sake. I mean, see, there's a lot of loving reasons to seek justice, but not if you do a vengeance reason, the reason I'm seeking justice is I really want to make that person as unhappy as they made me. I tell you, you'll always overreach, you'll go beyond very often what justice demands. That's the whole idea behind the lex talionis, the eye for an eye. Because honestly, if somebody puts out one of your eyes and you get them, your natural instinct is put out both of their eyes. You always go beyond justice if you haven't forgiven. And if you forgive, can you pursue justice out of love? And I would actually say if you don't forgive, you won't pursue justice out of love. And very often you'll go astray. You'll be too angry. You won't do the right thing. You certainly aren't going to win the perpetrator over at all. You're not going to convince that perpetrator. That perpetrator will perceive that you're out just to get him. Let's say it's a him. And that's the reason why I say you have to both forgive and do justice. That was not an issue in Hopewell, Virginia in the 1970s or 80s. People just knew I need to forgive. But today there's more concern for justice, especially amongst younger people. And I have to show them how you can do both.
Now, here's a personal question for you. You've lived with a very serious diagnosis of cancer for the last 2 years. And however you feel, you look great and you're robust and active and churning out a new book. Do you think that the gift of forgiveness has prolonged your life, given you a sense of peace and energy that maybe you would not have had if you were living with lots of grudges and resentments?
Well, I think I believe that yes, because we know that our bodies and our souls are together. They are, we are a whole. We all know that, frankly, anger and bitterness can create ulcers. I mean, the doctors will tell you about that. In fact, a really interesting story was when Dr. David Martin Lloyd-Jones is known, at least by some of your older listeners. He was he's long gone now, but he was a Welsh minister who preached in London for years. But before he went into the ministry, he was actually a physician. And one of the reasons though he was a trained physician and a practicing physician, one of the reasons he went into the ministry, he felt a call from God, he was a Christian. But he actually also noticed that all physicians recognize that a lot of the problems that people have physically come from problems they're having personally and emotionally. People who are under tremendous stress, people who are extremely angry, and it shows up in their bodies. And he felt like, as a Christian, he wanted to work on the part that created the ulcers, which is the anger and the forgiveness. So it probably has. I would almost certainly agree that if you can forgive, it's better health, and if you live with anger, it's not good for your health.
Now, you touched on this a little bit earlier in our conversation, and this is not the focus of your book, and maybe this needs to be your next book, but the idea of how societies and nations deal with forgiveness. Countries are not specifically Christian in the sense that an individual who can convert and become a Christian, but countries or societies can in some way forgive or not forgive. So what lessons from your book can be projected upon our society today, which you say is having great difficulties forgiving ancient historical
Yeah.
tragedies and sins?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a way forward using the church, and I'll tell you why. I'm part of, and I still am part of a ministry that grew out of my church in New York, Redeemer. It's called Redeemer City to City, and what it does is it helps people it helps national leaders in their own countries reach their own cities and start churches. So we are actually a network of hundreds of, after all these years, we're a network of hundreds of churches in every major city of the world. And recently I did a Zoom call with 60 to 80 what we call global leaders. These are people from every continent. And we talked about this very subject. And what they said is that, for a good example is that, there are people in India. There are churches in India that have got people from different people groups that out in the world are at war with each other, essentially. In fact, in almost every one of these countries, especially because of cities, cities are melting pots. So if you go to Nairobi or if you go to Mumbai, go to these places, in those cities, you actually have all the different groups that are represented in the rest of the country, many of which are hostile to each other. And what they said is, in the churches, we actually have people from the groups that out in the rest of the country are sometimes literally killing each other. And what we need to do is we need to say to the Christians from inside, who are inside our church, to say, are you avoiding one another in the church? You come to church and you're sitting next to each other, but do you avoid each other? Do you only hang out with your own kind? Or are you trying to, can we show the rest of the country how forgiveness and grace in Christ enables us to get along with people that out in the rest of the world, they don't get along? And so a lot of these folks were excited about the idea of using the biblical resources for forgiveness and reconciliation inside their urban churches. Urban churches are usually quite racially or ethnically diverse. And by the way, that's especially true of our Pentecostals. The Pentecostal church is very often very multi-ethnic. And one of the things to do is, instead of just saying, hey, isn't it great to see all these different people groups sitting around and praising God? Said, well, but yeah, that's on a Sunday, but are you actually building bridges? Are you becoming friends? Are you getting along with people that out in the rest of the world that you would never want to see at all? And so they talk about using forgiveness and reconciliation inside the church as a model for the rest of the country, because it is a hard sell just to go out there and say Serbs and Croatians forgive each other and get along. And how do you do that? But inside the churches where you may have Serbs and Croatians, say in Zagreb or wherever, they can be a model. And that's even, by the way, that's even true in New York, because even people groups that are not particularly hostile to each other don't get along in the neighborhood. You look out there and you say, well, there's, in Astoria, there's the Greeks, there's the Spanish, there's the African Americans, there's the white, young professionals. And isn't it wonderful what a multi-ethnic city neighborhood? That's Astoria, Queens here in New York City. And yet when you actually look closely, those folks don't get along. They're all living together and you see them on the street together, but they basically have their own clubs. They have their own, they stay away from each other. But the church in Astoria, the churches of Astoria, are they able to bring those people groups together in a way that can show the rest of the world in the neighborhood it's really possible? It's really possible for us to build these bridges. So the answer is, yeah, I do think that forgiveness resources are important for people groups, not just individuals. But one of the best ways to do that is inside the church, rather than just speak to a whole country, which would be difficult. You have to show them it can be done in a sort of like a pilot plant. The church is a pilot plant of a new humanity.
On that very positive note, Dr. Timothy Keller, longtime now retired pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City, author of a new book coming out November 1st on forgiveness called Forgive. Thank you very much for a very uplifting, inspirational interview. We look forward to seeing and reading your book.
Thanks.